You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Christopher Media. Let's make some noise.
To Be or Not to Be is truly an outstanding motion picture, an exciting romantic comedy keyed to an ever-mounting tempo of suspense. To Be or Not to Be brings you the screen's beloved star, Carole Lombard, in the kind of role that won her the applause of millions. And that mirth-maker of the movies, that Casanova of the radio, your favorite comedian, Jack Benny, in something entirely new, something surprisingly different, and it's hilarious all the way. To Be or Not to Be is a swift-moving comedy melodrama, enriched by the magic that sparkles in every Ernst Lubitsch production. It's the picture everyone will want to see.
Welcome to the projection booth. I'm your host, Mike White. Joining me once again is Ms. Paula Guthat.
Hi, Mike. Thanks for having me back.
Also back with us is Mr. Ken Stanley.
Hi there.
And joining us is Mr. Lutz Bacher.
Good to be here for all this Lubitsch stuff.
The Lubitsch Palooza. This week on the projection booth, we are concluding our discussion of Ernst Lubitsch with a talk about his 1942 film, To Be or Not to Be. It's the story of Joseph and Maria Tura, two actors in Poland who are in a current run of Shakespeare's Hamlet, though they are working on a new play called Gestapo. The new play never happens on stage, but they're able to act it out in real life after Poland falls to the Nazis. The film is one of the first films to openly lampoon Nazis, made in a time before Pearl Harbor, though released afterwards, in a time when mocking Nazis was not acceptable as it should have been. We're going to be talking about and spoiling this film and the 1983 remake, so please be warned. Ken, when was the first time you saw To Be or Not to Be, and what did you think?
I believe I saw it at a screening at the Detroit Film Theater several years ago. And at that time, I saw it in a different light. I looked at it as being a typical Hollywood film of that era. And then I got to see more and more of Lubitsch, and I was able to recontextualize it. So recently, I feel like I've only really recently seen it, for the first time.
Lutz, how about you?
I actually went back into my old Bible from the early 70s when I first got seriously into film at Wayne State. And Andrew Sayre's American Cinema, and where I always put a check mark next to the films, especially of the Pantheon directors, of course. And I did see a good handful of the Shop Around the Corner. Probably my favorite one, I guess. The warmest one, I suppose.
Shop Around the Corner, yeah.
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 That's a favorite of mine, too.
Yeah.
Mine, too.
And sure enough, there was To Be or Not to Be among the bunch, but I don't know exactly where I saw it. It could have been the DFT where I went a lot, but I went to all of the venues at that point and religiously watched everything coming in over television as well. So. I don't recall seeing it on the big screen, though. Film needs to be seen on the big screen, too.
Yeah. How about you, Paula?
On TV, and I've watched this one so many times, I can't tell you when the first time I saw it was. I first watched it because of Carole Lombard, and then as I learned more about the history and the time and Lubitsch and the backstory and stuff, I've just really always liked it. The more I find out about it, the more I love it.
This was a first-time watch for me. I had never seen To Be or Not to Be except for this podcast, and I think that was one of the reasons why I chose this film, was to finally force me to sit down and watch this. I know of Jack Benny. He was such a major force in entertainment for so long, but other than a few bits here and there, I really haven't experienced too much Jack Benny. So this was one of those. And then also, I had more experience with the 1983 Mel Brooks film than I did with this. And I have to say, and I hope this doesn't upset any of the listeners at home, I really dislike that Mel Brooks film. We'll talk about it a little bit more later. So that kind of soured me on the idea of seeing the original because I kept hearing, oh, they're very, very similar. No, they are worlds apart.
I don't think they are at all.
Worlds apart. And my goodness, what a great film, and what a film that speaks to us all these years later. I think it's kind of like we were saying with last week with Trouble in Paradise, is just as relevant and fresh today as it was when it was made.
Yeah.
Sadly, still relevant.
I mean, these days you can't punch Nazis or make fun of Nazis, and this was kind of the same thing. You're not supposed to make fun of Nazis at this time. We're supposed to be nice to Mr. Hitler. This was, like I said, 1942 this came out. We're just getting into the war at the end of 1941, but before that, it was pretty much don't talk bad about what's going on in Germany.
There was a neutrality going on at that point in time. I gotta add that I think I had an aversion to Jack Benny, and that may have been an influence on my initial reaction to the film. Growing up, Jack Benny was what my mother watched on TV.
Huh.
You know?
Oh.
And so I was, it may be unfair of me to have made that judgment, but when I was a kid and first started watching television, that was when, the Beatles hit and stuff. So anything that seemed adult-like or something that the parents were watching, that was something that I had an aversion to, naturally. Now, of course, I've grown up, matured, gotten old, and go back to that stuff, and it was great. It was terrific, In fact, I've learned more about Jack Benny in the course of doing research for this and stuff. And he actually had a battle with the network that put him on television because he had been on radio for years and years and years. And they didn't want, whatever network wanted to do a show on television, they did not want Rochester to be part of it. And he stood adamant on that idea that they were opposed to that particular character when they realized that a black person was going to be doing it. And at that time, they tried to want him to make things simple. But Benny says, you take Rochester or you don't get me.
Right.
So, you find out little bits and pieces of things like that. And they say, this guy was actually pretty good natured, and it was fantastic comedic timing wise. And so I've grown in appreciation so that, the first time I saw it, I didn't know that stuff. Now I know that stuff, and now I have more appreciation for him as having been a performer. And so watching it recently has just been a delight.
I think was it Jack Benny that did that skit with Mel Blanc where he came in and was buying stuff at a store and driving Mel Blanc crazy to the point where Blanc ends up committing suicide? It was on his TV show, and it was fantastic.
Yes, sir. What can I do for you?
I'd like to see some wallets, please.
All right. We have a large variety here. All these wallets you see here are $1.98.
Well, they look nice. $1.98.
Yes, sir. Say, boss, here's some better wallets right here.
See. Don would love this one. This is a real nice one.
That's genuine cowhide.
Cowhide?
Yes, sir.
How much is that?
$40. Been with a long time, boss.
Well, all right. I think Don would like this. He has been with me a long time. I'll take this. Now, wrap it up as a gift and send it to Mr. Don Wilson, 4946 Whipset, Beverly Hills.
Beverly?
Yes, sir. Oh, here's your money. $40. Yes, sir.
I'll make a nice package.
Yeah, to do that. Wrap it up in a nice Christmas package.
Beautiful.
That's a 10. Let's see, there's 20, 10. There's $40.
All right, and thank you very much.
You're welcome. Oh, wait a minute. Before you put them, I want to write a nice note.
All right.
For him, a little card for Don. Just 1 second. To Don, this gift is from Jackie. Oh, golly, oh, shucks. I hope that you like it. It costs $40. Isn't that good?
Yeah, it would have been tough to get around for $1.98.
That rapport that he had with Rochester, especially on the radio, that's kind of where I finally first got turned on to him. But yeah, I know what you mean. Like, for me, it was Bob Hope. It was like, I want nothing to do with Bob Hope because he's this old guy.
Yes, right? Because when we were young, he was by it. He was in the 80s, he was intolerable.
Yes,
yeah.
Exactly.
And then I started to watch his old films, and I was like, wow, this guy's hilarious.
It's a revelation.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, Jack Benny, I had no this is my frame of reference for Jack Benny, to be or not to be.
Right.
Like, I never listened to him on the radio, never seen him on TV, and I have started going back very occasionally, listening to his radio shows, because Ronald Colman and his wife, Benita Hume, played his neighbors. And I love Ronald Colman. He has a beautiful voice. And Jack Benny, this was it for me for many years. That was it. And I mean, I kind of realized he played the violin. I knew about Rochester, not the backstory, and that he was notoriously cheap.
Right.
That's his shtick, right?
Your money or your life.
Right.
The shtick was that he was very vain.
Yes. And obviously.
Humble brags all over the place.
Right, yeah. The originator of the humble brag.
Yeah. Played the violin and always lied about his age, and then he was...
Right, 39.
39.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, now that I'm 39 myself, I'm so down.
Yeah, I just recently turned 39 myself.
Isn't it brilliant? It's the best age to be.
Yeah. It's interesting that one way that Lubitsch persuaded him to do that, and Benny desperately wanted to work with a great director. And Lubitsch told him that you're not really a comedian. You're an actor playing a comedian. And all of those traits that we just mentioned, they're all part of the acting performance. The only thing that's real is his love for the violin.
Yeah, this was produced by Korda. I can't remember the gentleman's first name.
Alexander Korda.
Okay. Tell me a little bit about the backstory to that.
Well, it's a really fascinating backstory, because all this confluence of things happening that made this ultimately as good a place to make a film as Paramount had been, because of all of these coincidences that gave him the best possible crew and the best possible major collaborators. He had, astonishingly to me, left Paramount as early as 1938, maybe 39, to go independent. Right? Yeah, okay. And he did it with a really unexpected figure, Saul Lesser, who produced, whose main stock and trade was making Tarzan movies, upper, lower, in the upper range of not quite poverty row, right, but not too far above that.
B plus.
And so C plus. Yeah, it's odd that Lubitsch wanted to work with him.
Yeah, why
he agreed to make each of the 4 films that we're going to make for $30,000 plus the percentage then. But that's way less than he got at Paramount, and so it was an odd setup, and it really turned out to be not workable. They made just one feeling, that uncertain feeling with film. That is not a very good film in his filmography. And so, To Be or Not to Be was to be the second one of the bunch, but they agreed to drift apart. Okay. So, and coincidentally, Alexander Korda was up to make a final film for United Artists before going back to Britain, and he'd been in the U.S. primarily, it seems, to be a propaganda arm for the British government, trying to get the U.S. to come in and help with the war effort. And he got knighted as soon as he got back. So he really apparently did a good job.
Right.
Didn't he go on to produce The Third Man, or am I thinking of somebody else?
I think he was involved for that.
I know he produced that Hamilton Woman, which was a bit propagandistic.
Yeah, that was the first. That was the second one. He came over with Thief of Baghdad.
Got it.
To finish that, because the North African locations for that were overrun by the war.
Right.
And so they had to find different locations.
And he had a brother that was involved.
Vincent Korda. Was great production designer.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So he finished Thief of Baghdad, made that Hamilton Woman, made Lydia, and then finally The Jungle Book. in fairly quick succession.
Within a couple of years.
Right.
Yeah.
A couple of years, 2-3 years at the most.
And he did all of that at General Service Studios, which I'm familiar with because I'm writing a book about Reynolds Studio Independent Production, and that's the key studio that I'm dealing with. So I knew about all of that. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden it goes off to Goldwyn, which was a competitor studio to General Service, but the one with the greatest reputation had been United Artists Studios. And then Goldwyn took us over, but there was still this connection with UA. Besides the Goldwyn films, some United Artists-related films were made there. Trouble is that Korda was running late, was over budget with Jungle Book, and couldn't get the money. And so if United Artists wanted to stay on good terms with Korda, which they wanted to, they had to come up with the funding for it. They did, and they did a very unusual thing for United Artists, which was to make the film themselves. United Artists didn't get involved in production.
Distribution, right?
So it was a very unusual setup. They started a production company called Romaine Film Corporation, and they came up with a production loan from the Bank of America for $1.2 million, which is about what they spent on making the film, which is pretty substantial. Mm-hmm. It's a longer film than Trouble in Paradise, but Trouble in Paradise was made for only $520,000. And so we had Saul Lesser having made that one film with him at Goldwyn Studio. So there was that connection with Goldwyn Studios already. And now Korda with his connection to UA and he had a connection with Goldwyn as well. Korda brought in his terrific personnel that he had on the General Service Studios films. Rudolph Maté, who was one of the great cinematographers. His brother Vincent Korda was a wonderful production designer, and also Lawrence Butler, who was fabulous. If you watch all those films that they made at General Service, you can know what a great special effects man he was. And you can see that along with Vincent Korda's contribution in that opening sequence where you see the city, and that's all special. Nothing there is real. It's all backlot magic. So those two, the Saul Lesser strain, the Korda strain, the United Artists contribution, and then finally the Goldwyn Studios backlot, as well as other creative staff like Julia Heron, who did the costume design for the film. She was the top figure for indies for costume design, and the sound people and all of that. The backlot at Goldwyn Studios was really top-notch. I had an opportunity to talk to some of those people, and that's the impression they gave me, that they were just a wonderful place to work. They had a big tank as well. They had a commissary, and so they were sort of up there with the major studios and the amenities that they provided. General Service was not. So it's a terrific package that fell into place because of all of those accidental contributions by people.
I want to talk about that opening and just, I talked a lot on the last episode about the way that our expectations are subverted. Talking about the trash man on the gondolier, and this is very much that same kind of thing as far as having our expectations subverted. As far as we open up with Hitler on a street in Poland, and this very, I think you used the word bombastic, voiceover artist.
We're in Warsaw, the capital of Poland. It's August 1939. Europe is still at peace. At the moment, life in Warsaw is going on as normally as ever. But suddenly something seems to have happened. Are those Poles seeing a ghost? Why does this car suddenly stop? Everybody seems to be staring in one direction. People seem to be frightened, even terrified, some flabbergasted. Can it be true? It must be true, no doubt. The man with the little mustache? Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler in Warsaw when the two countries are still at peace and all by himself?
He seems strangely unconcerned by all the excitement he's causing. Is he by any chance interested in Mr. Maslovsky's delicatessen? That's impossible. He's a vegetarian. And yet he doesn't always stick to his diet. Sometimes he swallows whole countries. Does he want to eat up Poland, too? Anyhow, how did he get here? What happened? Well, it all started in the general headquarters of the Gestapo in Berlin.
They won't explain it to us why Hitler is there in Poland. And then we go to a Gestapo office, and now here we see Jack Benny as this Gestapo officer, and there's this very elaborate scene of him getting a confession out of a child about the child's father is not happy with Hitler, and there's this whole thing of there's a joke that's being told about Hitler being a piece of cheese, and then eventually we get Hitler coming into the scene, everyone saying Heil Hitler, and when he says Heil myself, that's when we break. Oh, God, I love that line. That's when we break, and that's when we learn that we were actually on a stage, and that we rejoin that scene a little bit later on. That's great, but we have just been fooled as far as this is not Hitler. This is not a real Gestapo office. We are watching a play. Or a play in practice and progress.
A hack would have done this in a linear fashion. Right?
Yeah.
We start off with a shot of the theater. Right. We know we're at a theater. We see that a rehearsal of a play is being done. Then the guy goes outside and says, to prove that he looks like Hitler, goes out into the public. This is almost exactly backwards. And it is what distinguishes Lubitsch from a hack.
We are being lied to. Yeah. We are being lied to in this scene.
Yeah. Once again.
And the whole movie is about lying. So there you go.
Once again, beginnings are always difficult. Right. The line from Trouble in Paradise that Herbert Marshall says. The title in and of itself, I think, is worth talking about because it is it's kind of meta. The whole idea of how it relates to actors, to be or not to be, in the sense of to be this character or to be your own person or to just act or
to exist or not to exist.
It's existential.
Right.
The very core of that title. Of course, it comes from Hamlet, which is one of the plays that they're performing Hamlet and rehearsing Gestapo.
That's also the line that is the signal for her lover to go to her. Because she knows where he's going to be.
I find it hysterically funny that Joseph Tura, the actor portrayed by Jack Benny, needs to be prompted.
Yes. Every time he has to be prompted to say to start
not to be. Well, he's nervous because this guy keeps getting up and leaving.
But I'm saying the first time we see the very first time.
Oh, that's true. Yeah,
that's
true.
There's a prompt guys underneath the footlights.
To be or not to be.
Or not to be.
To be or not to be.
If you're not ready to perform that particular sequence.
Right. It's the first line of the scene. It's the first line of the most famous soliloquy that there is.
Right, exactly.
And the young prince. I always like that too, how he's the young prince. Even though he's 39.
The young prince.
I was going to say he's got to be 39.
Oh, yeah.
At least.
Yeah, that is wonderful. Yeah, and the whole idea too of it being Hamlet and the whole thing of, Hamlet having the fake play within the play in order to catch the conscience of the king, and we're going to do this, and that we are practicing Gestapo, but then we get to play it out in real life later on.
Yeah.
That is so wonderful. I mean, just the structure of this film.
The notable things about the play Hamlet is that Hamlet is
is he mad or is he not mad? That's always the question.
Also he's somebody who is not quick to action.
Right.
That he spends the entire play being indecisive and always asking these rhetorical questions, including to be or not to be. It's the whole idea is that should I do this or should I do that? Should I do this or should I do that?
Right.
And he eventually tries diabolically to get everybody else to do his bidding for him in one way or another.
Right.
And everybody ends up dead.
Right.
To the point that Lutz made earlier, as far as this being, produced by this guy who gets knighted for his work in war propaganda. Should we go into the war or should we go into the war?
Yep.
This is very
there's an indecisive.
Yeah, exactly.
And the decisive thing happened during the making of the film.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, no, the thing for us definitely happened at that point with Pearl Harbor. The thing for them already had happened with the invasion of Poland. And we're not doing anything about that. The U.S. is sitting on their hands, and we're just like,
so embarrassing.
Should we be or should we not be? We're turning back boatloads of Jewish people, Jewish refugees, and talking with we'll hear the interview with Joseph McBride later, but. Hey, we have stories about concentration camps, but they're being put on, page 30 of the New York Times. They're not being front page news. So
there's an angle that I mentioned, or tried to mention earlier, wanted to, that it was only the fifth major Nazi film. The floodgates opened after.
Pearl Harbor.
Hangman also died. Fritz Lang came in 43 and so on. And many low-budget ones as well. But there was the first one in 39 at Warner Brothers, which was the most aggressive against the in the anti-Nazi movie, Confessions of a Nazi Guy by Anatole Litvak, The Mortal Storm by Frank Borzage in mid-1940. All release dates. Manhunt by Lang in June of 1941, and Sarnite by John Cromwell, also in mid-1941. And so this was certainly, he was being relatively aggressive with doing that.
Well, in America, there was a general kind of neutrality for a certain amount of time. Prominent Americans were actually boosters of Hitler to one extent or another. There's at least Henry Ford was at least sympathetic. Charles Lindbergh.
Well, Ford and GM were meeting in New York City with German representatives. Because
Ford was
they wanted to, and they wanted to hedge their bets in case the Nazis took over everything.
Yeah, no, I mean, Henry Ford himself loved the Nazis, loved what the Nazis represented, and was all about, white power and white supremacy. So it's just
cheap labor.
Really embarrassing. Exactly.
It is. It's really embarrassing.
And then the whole story about the consulate in L.A. being right on top of that whole situation, trying to nip in the bud anything that was anti-Nazi.
There's a really great book, if you guys haven't read it. It's called Hollywood and Hitler. It came out from Columbia a few years ago. It really does a great job of talking about this prohibition against anti-Nazi sentiments coming through in films. And I highly recommend that.
I have to say too that Pearl Harbor had a very great effect on Carole Lombard. I don't know if it's time for me to talk about that.
Yeah, please talk about Carole Lombard, because she's
a war hero in my opinion. She's a war hero. So Carole Lombard, obviously the star Maria Tura, she was born on October 6th, 1908 in Fort Wayne, Indiana, as Jane Alice Peters. And she had started in the silent era at the age of 12. And by the late 20s, she was starring in Mack Sennett comedies. And she was a tomboy, loved to run around, do her own stunts, all of that stuff. And she survived into talkies. She had an acceptable voice, what have you. And so she had signed with Paramount, and they weren't quite sure what to do with their new star. This was in the early 30s. She was also known as the Profane Angel because she swore like a sailor, but she looked like an angel. So when Pearl Harbor happened, immediately Hollywood kind of came together. Like there was the Victory, Hollywood Victory Committee, and Betty Davis and John Garfield put together the Canteen, Hollywood Canteen, and all of that stuff. So it was like, I feel like the actors were into it. And so Clark Gable was the chair of this Hollywood Victory Committee, and she went on a war bond drive very early, like January 1942, like it had just happened. The day after she sold the record amount of war bonds, she sold $2 million worth of war bonds in one day. Then she decided to fly home to Hollywood because she thought Clark Gable might be carrying on with his co-star at the time, Lana Turner. And so she hopped on a DC-3 with her mother and Clark Gable's agent, who had been accompanying her on this trip. And they couldn't make it. She was in Indiana and she needed to get to Hollywood. They couldn't make it the whole way. So they stopped in Las Vegas, and when they took off again, the plane crashed into a mountain and everyone aboard perished. She was the first woman killed in World War II, first American woman to die on a war mission in World War II, and she was awarded the Medal of Freedom posthumously. And Clark Gable never got over his guilt that she wanted to get back so soon because of his lifestyle. And the irony is he had actually been planning a surprise welcome back party for her.
With Lana Turner.
I don't know if Lana Turner was involved, but he wasn't fooling around with Lana Turner.
That's terrible.
Right? I think that wasn't until later, but it was not the case. I'm not saying he never fooled around. I wasn't there, but in this case, it was not true. He was planning a surprise victory party for her.
I know she was
welcome party.
She was very patriotic. I know that.
She was very patriotic.
She had signed a contract, which in today's dollars would have amounted to something like $7 million a year, and during the contract system back then. And she pointed out that, it's a lot of money. I give 80% of my income back in taxes, and I'm proud to do that.
Okay.
And FDR cited her and wrote a letter to her saying they appreciated that she would make that statement, that she had no problems helping her country with that giant tax burden upon her.
Right.
A lot of people would have complained about it, right? Yeah, I mean, today can you imagine
everyone complains about it.
Yeah.
Everyone does.
Yeah.
And so To Be or Not to Be was her final film.
Yeah. Yeah, and they say that her death might have negatively affected the box office of it, but I mean, who knows?
I don't know about that.
Also, how are they going to promote this film? I mean, I guess they're going to promote it as an anti-Nazi film, but still at the same time, some people saw this as being in such poor taste that they were making fun of the Nazis rather than, criminalizing them. I mean, and we can talk about that as far as parody versus, outright outrage. And I'm somebody more to parody something or to poke fun at it, just to point out the absurdity. It's easier to laugh than to get angry sometimes.
Yeah. And certainly more people are going to, if you can sneak it in the humor, more people are going to listen to it than are going to listen to somebody preaching or...
Right. It's much easier to slip that knife in between the ribs if you're making them laugh at the same time.
But it's the way people tend to approach things, and it has to deal with sensibilities. And I think that the public sensibilities at that time, because they had loved ones who were fighting the war after the war had officially started, And so it's tough for them, a lot of people, if they had a son, a brother, who was actually over there risking their lives on a day-to-day basis, it'd be tough to say, well, let's just parody these people.
Right.
No, the propagandistic approach was far more to their liking. The horrible, what we see now as being like the horrible, like Warner Brothers cartoons depictions of Japanese and whatnot, those characterizations and stuff that were, got way past the ideology of the war, way past the ideology of Hitler and Mussolini and actually attacked the nationalities, right? That's something Lubitsch it's just not in his DNA to do that to begin with. But I think that is what the people were so mad and angry and worried about their loved ones that they couldn't help but to hate, genuinely hate, and it would get to that level. And the more propagandistic films supplied that kind of.
I mean, we get to some of those points. I mean, we hear the word concentration camp quite a few times, but it's funny. I mean, this movie is really hilarious, and I just I can't help but I mean, they're doing everything right as far as I'm concerned. As far as the jokes, everything lands, and you know that there are horrible things going on. But to your point, Paul, it's not preachy, but there are moments in here. I mean, especially the Shylock speech and the way that comes back 3 times in this film. I mean, again, another nice nod to Shakespeare going on. And I think there's even a Friends, Romans, Countrymen line at some point. So we really have this whole script just steeped in Shakespearean references. It works. Everything works.
It's interesting, though, that there is a scene where Selitsky is trying to recruit Maria Tura to become an agent for the Nazis.
Right. And for people listening at home, Selitsky is a guy who I guess he's a professor. At least that's what he goes by. And he's actually a double agent. He's over in Britain at one point, and he gets the names and addresses of all of these British soldiers or Polish soldiers who are fighting in Britain, and it's taking those back to the Nazis to give those over. So it's a pretty big deal that basically all of their loved ones are in danger now.
Yeah.
So.
At a certain point, we're skipping ahead in plot and story.
Yeah, no problem.
But a lot of the points we're making brings to mind certain aspects of the film. He's recruiting Maria, this beautiful or very attractive, famous, established actress who he's trying to get her to work for the Nazis get some information about various Poles, I imagine. And in the process of doing that, he has her in his, where he's staying.
Yet another Lubitsch hotel room.
Lubitsch hotel room.
My goodness, hotel rooms are everywhere.
and he tries to point out to her that, Nazis aren't all that. We're not different from you people. We like to sing, we like to dance. And it brings to mind Shylock's.
Exactly.
Shylock's, have I not,
If you prick me, do not bleed.
So that's the way Lubitsch approaches things. I mean, it's like he wants to remind you that these are people too.
Right.
And it's the ideology that should be
right. That's
hated.
the villain.
Because once again, I think I spoke with you briefly earlier today about this, is Lubitsch doesn't have like any real monster in any of his films that you can obviously point to and say, that guy is evil incarnate, or that's the manifestation of the worst human impulses.
Though it is nice that when the real Hitler shows up later in the film, that he doesn't give him any voice.
He does not.
He
and
just
Bronsky.
gives him voice through Bronsky.
Yeah.
But Bronsky publicly.
Right.
In a public, like in the confrontation with Greenberg in the corridor, he doesn't say a word as Hitler.
No, exactly.
And as Hitler in public, he doesn't say a word as Hitler. True. He only speaks with the Hitler disguise on when he's talking to his other actors outside of the context of any kind of public thing. So Nazism itself is not given any voice in the film.
I think it's very telling that the person that recognizes Bronsky as Bronsky, when we go back to that scene in the beginning, is a little girl. That she's the one that comes up and asks for his autograph. It's this whole like Emperor's New Clothes kind of thing, where it's just like out of the mouths of babes. She's the one that can recognize that he is who he is. He's not Hitler. He's not the monster. And she's the one that asks for the autograph. And then everyone else gives that sigh of relief. And then we kind of carry on with the rest of the film.
It's really interesting when you take into consideration Lubitsch's delicate handling of Nazis. It's interesting when you note that Lubitsch was name-checked in Goebbels' documentary, The Eternal Jew, a propaganda film, a Nazi propaganda film, wherein all these people are terrible. Albert Einstein, Jew, and they're all equated to rats and everything.
Right.
And there's a clip in The Eternal Jew that focuses on Lubitsch. So he had been propagandized as being the scum of the earth or whatever just a couple of years prior, probably a year prior to the production of To Be or Not to Be. And yet he has this deft handling of Nazism and that situation. And he doesn't demonize anybody like he himself got demonized by them.
Yeah, and it goes back to his early comedies where he was a prototypical caricature of a Jew.
Right.
So that's where they picked it up.
Jack Benny was kind of doing that as well. I mean, we talked about the aspects of his character of Jack Benny and that whole thing of him being so cheap. I mean, that just speaks to like the Jewishness of the character as well, I think. And just, you talked about Carole Lombard as being who she is, and then Jack Benny being the other half of this equation, who has real skin in the game by being an American Jew in this situation. I think he grew up in Europe, or his family was from Europe. So he's got vested interest in this kind of stuff. And then, of course, Lubitsch. Lubitsch, I talked last week in the interview with Joseph McBride. He was one of the few Jews who didn't come over during that emigration that we saw after, Hitler started to come to power. he knows what the score is, and he is one of the ones who's being, targeted specifically in the Eternal Jew. So yeah, there were so many people in here that had an interest in making this succeed and doing wonderfully. So, and you were talking about the idea of, putting on the play and how so much of this stuff is acting, how Jack Benny was acting this Jack Benny character. Right, the acting in this movie and the way that we play these scenes out multiple times, and the way that Jack Benny moves from character to character is fantastic. The way that he is the professor at one point, and then first he's the Nazi officer, basically being that same character that he was in Gestapo, the play that doesn't get produced, and then he becomes the professor, and just the way that he moves from one. And when Earhart, the real Earhart, laughs at one of the jokes, and the way that Benny, who's now as the professor, is like, I knew you'd react that way. And just like, it's such a nice, my acting instincts were correct. And I really appreciate that the dialogue just comes back time and again because of these ways that we're doing that. And even the first time when they play that on stage, basically, or the first time that they have him as Earhart and the professor is the professor, that it is happening in the theater, but someplace else, not the actual real office, but it looks exactly the same as the real office later on. It's nice how it kind of is like, we were that good at this that we could make you think that this was a real Nazi office.
And the theater also later becoming the place where Hitler himself is.
Right.
Yeah. It's a play on that.
Boy, oh boy, did I get a real Inglourious Bastards feel at the end of this movie.
Oh, for sure.
Right.
Yeah, for sure. And the other movie it reminds me of, have you guys ever seen The Last Metro?
No, I want to, though.
It's about...
Was that Luc Besson?
It was Truffaut.
Can't remember. Yeah,
Truffaut.
it is
Okay.
Truffaut.
What am I thinking?
It's with Gérard Depardieu, and I forget who...
Catherine Deneuve.
Catherine Deneuve. And it's a theater company, and they're hiding their principal, who is Jewish. They're hiding him in the basement. He's hidden. They're hiding him. And it's kind of like a melancholy to be or not to be. Pardon?
I was going to say Design for Living is Jules and Jim.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. You're right.
So I'm not surprised that,
Well, I think Francois Truffaut went on the record saying there's no such thing as a throwaway shot in
Lubitsch film.
Every
Yeah, it's
single
true.
shot means something. So nothing is there just for decorative purposes. So yeah, he was definitely a fan. So you were talking about The Last Metro.
Oh, just that it's it's a theater company. They're hiding the principal, the Joseph Tura character they're hiding him away because he is Jewish to save his life. And, not surprisingly, the Gérard Depardieu character and the Catherine Deneuve character get together. And, he's younger than her. And it just reminds me of a melancholy to be or not to be.
How surprised was I watching To Be or Not to Be the first time and realizing that it's Robert Stack as her
I was
dog lover.
Shocked.
Right?
I was like, was he born? The guy had a really long career.
Oh, yeah.
He must have been, I could look this up obviously, but it must have been in his 20s. I can't imagine.
But he's still Robert Stack.
He's still,
yeah.
Oh, yeah.
No, the voice, totally, but the look is a little bit different.
Yeah.
Like the hair is wavier or something.
Yeah.
So I didn't really make that connection immediately.
I think it took me a couple watches to be like, oh my God, that's Robert Stack, the Robert Stack, not like Robert Stack Sr. and Robert Stack Jr., like Alan Hale or Lon Chaney, but it's Robert Stack. And he's got his own little comedic thing going too. He's
the scenes in the bedroom when Jack Benny comes in?
Yeah, right.
Oh yeah, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
I love that.
When he's introduced in the film, when Robert Stack first appears, it's because he's been sending a MASH note, more or less. And it's gotten backstage to Maria Tura. He wants to set up a meeting with her. And I love the scene where her assistant and her discuss this note and everything because they're saying the proper things, but you can just tell by the way they're saying the proper things. That, okay, well, you know what? She wants to check this out. She wants to check this
she's interested.
out. And they're saying things like, he must be suffering, not having not
He's
having
lonely.
access to you. He must be a poor boy. And, the dialogue as written can be done any number of things, but it's done so slyly by the two ladies that you know that this may be something that they've done before or gone through this type of situation before.
Through the numbers.
Yeah, it's like, and at the end of the whole discussion, should she accept an invitation to meet with this person or not? And she ultimately says, I owe it to my public.
Right. And those things when he comes back and he's questioning her about all those things. She's like, what are you talking about? And then that he was such a big admirer that he read all the movie magazines, which are completely phony and all made out. Like, what happened to the fish? It's like, what the hell are you talking about?
Yeah.
I love that Lubitsch is not the only time in the film that he kind of like takes a poke at inside show business type of thing. Just bringing up the idea that the notion that the fan magazines may be full of shit. And the relationship between actors and actresses and their public are not necessarily what Hollywood publicity machine would have you believe,
And there's always a certain amount of deception in his films. Not in a mean way, but people are always kind of deceiving or...
Well, this whole thing, this whole movie is all deception.
Yeah. Even to a certain extent in Trouble in Paradise, where we had discussed appearance versus reality.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Lily's phone call and all that. Yeah. We can talk about how chaste the relationship is between Robert Stack and Carole Lombard in here, but, there's still that moment when she's talking about if they had a baby, if she and Jack Benny had a baby together.
Sweetheart, the dress stinks.
You're only afraid I'm running away with the sea.
Hi, afraid? Why should I be?
No, of course not. You're the greatest actor in the world. Everybody knows that, including you.
Don't be a prima donna.
Whenever there's a chance to take the spotlight away from me, it's becoming ridiculous the way you grab attention. Whenever I start to tell a story, you finish it. If I go on a diet, you lose the weight. If I have a cold, you cough. And if we should ever have a baby, I'm not so sure I'd be the mother.
I'm satisfied to be the father.
All right, yeah, you know what time it is, too. He's not being fooled by any of this.
Yeah. But it's similar in the relationship between Kay Francis and Gaston in Trouble in Paradise in that, and I think that Maria Tura is looking at it in that kind of same light, is like, I'd like to fantasize about possibly having a relationship with this individual,
right?
Even though I know that it's just not practical at all. I am, after all, married. An actress married to an actor.
Right.
Who's essentially her boss.
Yeah. But it's intriguing. Tell me about how much dynamite you can drop.
Right. Oh, yeah, which totally is. I mean, talk about coded sexual metaphor.
Yeah. Of course. But they're both terribly vain.
Oh, yes.
Joseph and Maria are both very, very vain.
And this is drawing someone in who's willing to praise them.
Right.
So who can resist?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, of course, you've heard
even
of Tura.
Yeah.
Right. And the whole thing of when Robert Stack first meets her and he starts spinning that whole thing about how they can be together, and as soon as he talks about taking her out of the acting life, then that's it.
It's over.
You're just going to be around to sing my praises.
Right.
You stepped over the line there, buddy.
Yeah, it's not.
Come on, this isn't real. It was never real to begin with. Yeah.
Right.
I want to talk about concentration camp Earhart.
Colonel, you're quite famous in London. You know what they call you? Concentration Camp Earhart.
Oh, they do they? So they call me Concentration Camp Earhart.
I thought you would react just that way.
The actor that plays him is wonderful. And then I love that he was Sergeant Schultz in Stalag 17.
Oh, Sigrun.
Yeah. And those faces, he pulls some amazing faces in this movie. He is just wonderful to watch.
This is an excellent example of like Lubitsch, instead of having evil incarnate as a Nazi,
Right.
He's like a amiable goof.
He is such a goof,
Yeah.
And then his aide-de-camp, Captain Schultz, which is funny. And then he's played by, Henry Victor, the guy who was Hercules in Freaks. So that was so nice to see him. And my God, the comic timing on him. He was fantastic, too.
The worst things you can say about the Nazis who are actually depicted in this film is that they're a little stiff. That's the worst thing you can say about them.
Yeah.
Is that they're a little stiff, they're a little formal. They don't seem to have a great sense of humor.
Right.
That's about the worst thing you can say about them.
Well, and the only real bad guy in here is that professor, and the one you know, he wants to.
And he's the one who gets to die.
And he's the one who gets to die, and I think that's perfect for him.
But still, in all, I mean, like he has moments, like I said, and he does make his case where he's like, I like to sing, I like to dance, you know.
Right.
If you prick me, do I not bleed?
Right. By the end of the night, though, you'll be saying "See Kyle," which I think is kind of also a sexually coded metaphor.
Which is an odd sexually coded metaphor.
Yeah. I think Stephen Miller uses that as a pickup line.
Oh my God. I wouldn't be surprised.
Right?
I just read that when war breaks out in Poland, there's a scene where gravestones are destroyed by the bombing of German forces. And one of the gravestones says Benjamin Kobelski, which was Jack Benny's real name.
Yeah.
Also that his father wasn't too thrilled with him.
Yeah, I hear he
for making
stood
that
up
movie.
and walked out of the room.
Yeah.
when,
I think it was just too soon. Too soon to not be condemning them outright. Like you said, the propagandic approach was probably most preferred at the time.
In the appointment book, where they're looking to see Maria Tura's name in the appointment book.
Oh, okay, yeah.
The name just underneath hers is Schindler.
Oh, wow.
It's just something I noticed last night. So.
He was on the list, huh?
You notice this list, huh? I'm always making lists.
Oh.
In fact, that's probably why Steven Spielberg cast me as Oscar Schindler's List. I said, Steven, I make lists all the time. And he said, that's exactly what I'm looking for. What's funny?
So, I thought you were joking about getting the part of Oscar Schindler because you made lists.
No. As an actor, you need stuff to draw on. And I drew on that.
Okay.
All right, we're going to take a break and play the conclusion of our interview with Professor Joseph McBride, author of How Did Lubitsch Do It? And we'll be back right after these brief messages.
Let me ask you a question. Are you getting enough? I bet you'd love more, right? Well, AdamandEve.com wants to give you more with 10 free gifts. First, you'll get a sexy surprise for her. Second, a specially selected toy for him. And third, a little something we know you'll both enjoy. Plus, you'll get 6 full-length adult movies on DVD. And number 10, free shipping on your entire order. So what do you have to do to get your 10 free gifts? It's not hard. Just go to AdamandEve.com and select any one item. It could be an adventurous new toy, sexy piece of lingerie, or anything you desire. Just enter offer code BOOTH at checkout, and you'll get all 10 free gifts. Go check out AdamandEve.com today. Select one item and get 10 free gifts, including free shipping when you enter offer code BOOTH. That's BOOTH at AdamandEve.com.
Hello from Cinema Detroit. We are Metro Detroit's only truly independent cinema, and also the only first-run, 7-day-a-week movie theater in Greater Downtown. We deliver an eclectic mix of mainstream, art, indie, genre, cult, and classic movies in the heart of the city. Like a sommelier choosing wine or a DJ mixing a set, we handpick our slate of films, many of which are exclusive to the metro area, the state of Michigan, or the entire Midwest region. Cinema Detroit features a unique setting in a former furniture store and a warm neighborhood atmosphere, including always fresh popcorn, Detroit-made Faygo soda, and other locally created treats. Please visit our website, cinemadetroit.org, for the latest features and showtimes. You can also like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter, Tumblr, and Instagram. We look forward to seeing you soon at 4126 3rd Street in the city, 48201.
All right, I'm here with Bill Byforce and Mr. Chris to tell you a little bit about Outside the Cinema.
All right, Reverend Scott, take us to church.
What can we expect to find from a typical show?
2 hours of just random blabber.
Is there anyone's coattails you rode in on to popularity?
I'm the guy that burns the coattails and then pisses on him.
You review all these exploitation, horror, comedy, cult, and often all-around terrible movies. You must have a strong driving force that keeps you going.
Ego.
I don't know if I've heard you say that before.
Yeah, I've been saying that for a while.
Really?
I have been saying that for a while. Also, I'm high on smack.
Well, it's definitely working for you guys. People are coming out in droves to support you on iTunes.
We just the other day got a 1-star review on iTunes.
Well, that is 1 star too many. Let me tell you, the worst f***ing piece of shit I've ever heard.
This has been great, guys.
Thanks, Scott. That was good. Oh, he's got you crying over there.
I'm good for the rest of the year.
Nice.
That was too much.
This is Adam Spiegelman, the host of my second favorite movie podcast called Proudly Resents at proudlyresents.com. And you are listening to my favorite, the number one, The Projection Booth. Mike put so much work into it. If you listen to my show, I put no work into it. Enjoy the rest of the show, you lucky son of a gun.
So I know that Trouble in Paradise was based on a play, and you said that a lot of Lubitsch's works were. Was To Be or Not to Be also based on a play? And don't say Hamlet, please.
It's a theater troupe, and they're putting on Hamlet, and they also put on a play called Gestapo, which is a fictional play that doesn't exist, but they're rehearsing it at the beginning, and then in real life they kind of act out a play about the Gestapo in a sense. But it was based on a story idea by Melchior Lengel, who is a Hungarian Jewish writer who contributed the stories for 5 Lubitsch films. It was not a play, it was just an idea that he had. He also contributed the story of Ninotchka, and he was paid for just 3 lines of treatment of Russian commissar comes to Paris, a woman who's very strict, and she has a disdain for capitalism, and when she comes to Paris, she falls in love with capitalism and luxury, and that was the story, and they expanded that into a film, but it was the whole story. And he wrote the play that Angel was based on, which is a terrific Lubitsch film, and he wrote a play called The Tsarina, which was a successful play in the 1920s that was adapted by Lubitsch for Forbidden Paradise, one of his best silent films, and then that was remade by Lubitsch as a royal scandal. Lubitsch produced that. At that point, he had had a couple of heart attacks, and his doctors were forbidding him to direct. So he kind of was sitting on the set, but it was directed by Otto Preminger, not a very good film. So Lengel has credits for originating 5 Lubitsch films, and as I've been telling my students, don't forget who this guy is. He's, because the idea is so important. It's like I once asked Billy Wilder on the screenplay credits of Sunset Boulevard, it says Charles Brackett, Billy Wilder, and D.M. Marshman Jr. And I said, who is D.M. Marshman Jr.? It's his only film credit. He said, we were thinking of making a movie about a silent movie star. And this guy came along, he was writing for Life magazine, and he said, why not have the silent movie star fall in love with a young screenwriter, and he becomes her kept man, and she winds up killing him. He said that's all he contributed. Well, I mean, that's the whole story, right? There's often somebody like that in Hollywood who comes up with the story. And Wilder once said that the crucial moment in filmmaking is the first 7 seconds, he said, when you get the idea, because it's either good or bad. He says he thought it was fated from the beginning. The whole film, the whole long process of making a film is either going to work or it's not going to work based on the idea. If the idea is no good, no matter what you do, it's just not going to work. So the person who has that idea deserves a lot of credit. But it can be done badly. You could give the same pitch for Ninotchka to different people, and actually they had various writers working on it, and a couple of different directors were going to do it, and they all would have done different things with it. But Lubitsch and his writing collaborators were the ones who brought it to perfection, so they deserve tremendous credit as well. So you can take a good idea and mess it up. But no matter how hard you try to mess up a good idea, something remains from it. So I bet other versions of Ninotchka might have been pretty good, but maybe not great.
Can you tell me a little bit about the other person that's credited as screenwriter on that, Edwin Justice Mayer?
He was the writer on To Be or Not to Be. He gets the sole writing credit for screenplay, and then Lengel gets the story credit. Mayer he was one of the writers on Desire, which was a Lubitsch production, not a very good film, 1936. He was a playwright, and he was European as well. And so a number of European people who had direct experience of the rise of Nazism worked on To Be or Not to Be. And Mayer was known for a certain penchant for black comedy. He wrote a play in the 1920s that was very dark. It took a dark sensibility to be able to make humor out of that situation of the Nazis taking over Poland and how they're ridiculous characters. And what got Lubitsch in trouble to some extent was he portrayed the Nazis as sort of buffoons, dangerous buffoons, but buffoons. Bosley Crowther of the New York Times, who could be counted on to, as Pauline Kael said, to get everything wrong all the time. He wrote an attack on that film, and he said he was outraged that the Nazis were portrayed as a joke, And Lubitsch wrote a rare rebuttal, and he said, usually in films, the Nazis are portrayed as vicious sadists, whipping people and killing people and stuff. And he said, my Nazis have gone beyond that. They're in a different phase where it's become routine to them, so they make jokes about it, But that requires a certain subtlety on the part of the audience to understand that. Sig Ruman's character, who they call Concentration Camp Earhart, which is a line that he thinks is hilarious about himself, which gets a lot of laughs today. Back then, it kind of shocked people. He orders killings, like kind of casually. He'll pick up the phone and say, round up all those resistance fighters and have them killed. And then, like a moment later, he'll be trying to seduce Carole Lombard or making jokes with Jack Benny. And it's chilling, the juxtaposition of his job with his, human side, his foibles, being a person who's deeply insecure and terrified of Hitler. And I mean, that's one of the points of the film, is that the Nazis in the film are always terrified of getting in trouble themselves. And that's a good insight that fascism works on fear quite often. You inspire fear in your subordinates. So these characters who are very fearful to us and the people in the film are also afraid. And if somebody's afraid, you can conquer them, And so Lubitsch was making that point. And Mayer was very good at writing those scenes. They're just wonderfully written scenes and very clever. And Truffaut had a great comment on To Be or Not to Be. He said, I defy you 20 minutes after watching that film to tell me the plot. It's just impossible, And if you ask me right now, to explain the plot, I'd have a hard time because it's so surprising constantly. Every time you see that film, it's surprising. I showed it the other day in class, and toward the end, I kind of forgot how they're going to get out of this final mess that they're in and how they plan to do it. And that's really interesting because the film is so fresh if it surprises you each time you see it, because I've seen some films 20, 30, 40 times or more, and every line, every scene, and maybe after a while you get a little tired of it. The Manchurian Candidate is a book like that by Richard Condon. I've read that 7 times now, more than I've read any other novel. And I must say, every time I read that book, it seems completely new to me. Like, I'm constantly amazed at every twist and turn. It's bizarre, and that's part of the reason, but it is extremely clever. And so To Be or Not to Be has that audacity, and part of it is the extreme intelligence of the characters outwitting the Nazis. Like when Jack Benny is confronted with a dead body, it's kind of hard to explain, and he figures out in a flash how to get out of the situation. And it might take a normal person longer to figure out what to do, or most of us couldn't even figure out how to get out of that situation. But he's so clever, he figures it out. And Lubitsch doesn't waste time showing him standing around thinking about it too much. But it works very wonderfully, and he gets out of this situation, which is literally a matter of life and death.
You mentioned that Lubitsch worked several times with Edward Everett Horton. It doesn't seem like he had a troupe of actors that he would work with over and over again. How was he to work with his leading people?
Like a lot of great directors had favorite actors. Felix Bressart, who became kind of his alter ego, was in 3 films. Lubitsch made 72 films overall, but when you do 3 films with somebody, they stand out, and Bressart had 3 great parts in Ninotchka and Shop Around the Corner and To Be or Not to Be. And Horton was in a number of Lubitsch films. Trouble in Paradise, he's one of the 2 sort of eunuchs. Charlie Ruggles is another, and he's another guy that Lubitsch used a lot. They're both very clever comedians. In every film, Hollywood had this great stock of wonderful actors to draw on that we love, and they fill out the scenes. It's not just the main stars that make those films great, it's all the people around them. great directors like Lubitsch or Ford or Sturgis, to name three, Capra, they had certain favorite actors who pop up all the time, and that gives pleasure to us that, here's Harry Carey Jr. again. We love him, and we remember him in, other Ford films, and he's doing a different kind of character or an inflection of that, or sometimes Ford would repeat situations that they did in other films. And Capra had his favorites, Clarence Muse and Lionel Stander and people like that, and Claude Rains, and many, many wonderful people who would populate his films. And Sturgis had a fantastic stack company. And so Lubitsch has, Charlie Ruggles and Edward Everett Horton are both. Horton was known for prissy humor. He was kind of a clueless guy who would get outwitted and outraged about things, and that's funny. And Ruggles was sort of a madcap, kind of goofy guy, but he was always a little out of touch with reality. And he thought he was more funny and clever and good-looking than he really was, which is part of the humor of that character. He plays this very dull man in Trouble in Paradise, and he says, I like to take my fun and leave it, talking about women. you know that women wouldn't give this guy the time of day, and so he's completely deluded. And the two of them are both madly in love with Kay Francis, who's very glamorous, and she's not interested in either one of them. And she says to Edward Everett Horton a great line. She says, Francois, marriage is a beautiful mistake that two people make together. And then she pauses and says, but with you, Francois, it would be a mistake. I think that's one of the wittiest lines in Lubitsch. And then it cuts to him, and he's looking upset and befuddled. He just doesn't get it. So he's pursuing her all the way through the film. And she toys with these two guys in a kind of a sadistic way, but they're also kind of like pets. They're always around, And that's a running joke in the story. And then when Herbert Marshall comes in, who's a very handsome, suave, clever guy, she falls for him very quickly, and that makes these other two guys angry. And it works as a plot device because Horton is the one who exposes Marshall, realizes, puts it together. It's a really clever scene. It takes him a long time to figure out. It's a classic of delayed reactions. He's great at the sort of delayed slow burn, as they used to call it, But this is the epitome of that. It takes him about 10 minutes of screen time to figure out who Marshall is, and it's all very funny because, we know what he doesn't know. We're watching his slow brain trying to figure it out, and he does finally figure it out.
In To Be or Not to Be, I love how blatantly Carole Lombard is cuckolding Jack Benny.
Yeah, it isn't quite clear if she's actually, this is the ambiguity that they had to do with censorship, whether she actually sleeps with guys or whether she's just flirting. It's kind of what they call in politics plausible deniability. You could look at that film if some censor says, well, she's sleeping with Robert Stack's character. Lubitsch could probably say, well, I never actually show that, and I don't say that, and, how do you know that? And then the censor would have to say, well, I think, and all that. Well, then it's in your dirty mind, right? And it's in our dirty mind, too, that maybe there's something going on. But there's partly that ambiguity, but also, like in Trouble in Paradise, in a more serious way, we're not actually sure if Marshall and Kay Francis sleep together. And in a way, it's not important because what's more important is they have an emotional connection, a love that grows, and that's ultimately more important in life than the physical things, which are important, but not as important. But we get more of a sense in that film they might have slept together. But To Be or Not to Be, my reading is that she's just flirting with this young guy who's good-looking, young Robert Stack in the early phase of his career, who's mad about her like a puppy dog, but she's kind of toying with him, and she gets a kick out of that. But we get the impression, and it's stated at one point in the film, that this is not the first time this has happened. This is her habitual demeanor, and she has a dresser who's an old woman who's very cynical, who kind of has seen it all happen many times before. We get the sense just from looking at the woman's reactions. And she's kind of shaking her head over it, like, here you go again. So we could probably infer that she's probably had some affairs, and Jack Benny has to put up with it. And he's a classic Schlemiel character who, he's constantly being put upon, and he's humiliated by her, and that's kind of funny, but in a sort of painful way too. And then he becomes a hero reluctantly in the course of the film, and we admire him, but we identify with him. I think we identify with Schlemiels and Schnooks, Jerry Lewis type characters or Jack Lemmon characters later on. And Lubitsch characters that he played as a young man in his early films were like that too. I mean, it's hard to identify with somebody who's a tremendous stud like Clark Gable or something, because we couldn't hope to be like that in real life, or Cary Grant. Those are people we might aspire to be. We wish we could be like Cary Grant, but we could never, achieve it. So it's easier to relate to somebody like a Jack Benny character, I think, And so the Carole Lombard stuff, it has a certain bite to the story, and Lubitsch's films are full of infidelity sequences and storylines that are done in different ways. He usually condones infidelity in a way that's very un-American. In Europe, they don't get as worked up about it. Like quite often a politician will have a wife and a mistress and nobody really cares. But in America, it's a big scandal, and somebody could be impeached for this, which seems like during the Clinton impeachment, people in Europe were kind of wondering, is America crazy or what? I mean, like this merits impeachment. The whole country is obsessed with this for a whole year. And it really hurt our country because it took people's eye off the ball of more serious things that were going on. But Lubitsch brought this continental attitude, which people enjoyed. And part of the appeal of movies, even for kind of straight-laced puritanical people, is the sort of forbidden pleasures we go to watch, whether it's sex or violence or whatever it is, things that we wouldn't do in our normal life. We kind of get a kick out of watching people do. And I also think movies are kind of a cautionary tale. It's like a dream. When you wake up, sometimes you have a very adventurous dream that's exciting or dangerous or disastrous, and you wake up and you think, oh my God. And then you realize, oh, that was just a dream. I'm really relieved. I'm sure that happens to all of us. And movies are kind of like that. And some movies are literally cautionary tales, like what not to do. Somebody who gets involved in some terrible criminal plot or horrible situation that you think, wow, I'm really glad I never did anything like that. But there's also a titillating factor that you go to movies and you kind of enjoy Carole Lombard flirting with young guys, even though you've liked the husband at the same time. It's kind of forbidden pleasures,
So you talked about how some people thought it was in poor taste to make To Be or Not to Be at this time, and I'm curious because when it came to the actual studio and the American reaction, weren't we supposed to still be pretty nice to Mr. Hitler at this point?
There is a lot of literature on this subject that the American studios were somewhat hesitant to criticize Nazism and deal with the coming war in Europe in the 30s, and there's some truth to that. There are a few films that do deal with it, that allude to it. Confessions of a Nazi Spy in 1939 was a famous one that really confronted it head on. Warner Brothers was a studio that was more courageous. They had a head of their Berlin office was beaten up by the Nazis, and so the Warners, who were liberals in that era, pulled their entire operation from Germany as a result. But the other studios were still dealing with Germany, and they wanted the money from German market, and also the foreign market in general was important to Hollywood. When World War II came in, it hurt Hollywood financially a lot because they couldn't show their films in Europe. But they were worried about it. A lot of the moguls were Jewish, and they were trying to assimilate and not rock the boat, as happened with a lot of American Jews in that period. Were trying to keep a low profile. There was a lot of anti-Semitism. And even during the war, some rabbis and other activists were trying to get public attention on the Holocaust and trying to get our government to do something about it. And shamefully, we didn't do anything. And Roosevelt felt winning the war would be the best thing to do. And then, that's the way to take care of Hitler. But by the time we won the war, he had killed 6 million Jews and several million other people in concentration camps, as well as all the other people who died. So it was not a good strategy, obviously. And the American media were terrible. The New York Times had a shameful record of minimizing reporting on the Holocaust. There's a whole book on that called Buried by the Times, which I'd recommend. So Hollywood was not too courageous, and they never are. But Chaplin in 1940 broke the taboo to some extent as well by making The Great Dictator, which preceded To Be or Not to Be. And that was a frontal attack on Hitler, even though it was a comedy, and his character was called Adenoid Hinkle, but it was obvious that it was a spoof of Hitler, and his cronies were, like Goebbels' character was called Garbage, for example, and Goering was called Herring. So he ridiculed them. He said later in his autobiography in the 60s that if he had known about the Holocaust, he wouldn't have made The Great Dictator. And however, anybody with any knowledge of world affairs would know from the newspapers that the Nazis were persecuting Jews from 1933 onward. And, they burned books and they were beating up Jews on the streets and killing them. And they passed the Nuremberg laws in 1935 to restrict the freedom of Jews. And the first concentration camp, Dachau, was opened in 1933. It wasn't a secret, And the Allies knew about the Holocaust from 1942 onward. We didn't call it the Holocaust until much later, by the way. That's a modern term. But in August of 42, people had been coming out of Europe trying to tell the Allied governments about what was going on. And the New York Times, as this book, Buried by the Times, points out, in the summer of 42, they ran a small item on something like page 20 of, inside the paper, saying reports out of Europe are 2 million Jews have been killed in Eastern Europe in recent months. And they buried it so deeply that, as the author says, if you don't put a story on page 1, and preferably in the banner headline, it signals to the audience, the readership, that it's not that important or we don't believe it necessarily. If you stick it on page 20, it was a story of just a few paragraphs. So it was known, but the public didn't want to know, or the government was trying to hide it from us. But somebody like Lubitsch knew what was going on, and it's quite clear. And then, of course, the Nazis invaded Poland under false pretenses and heavily attacked Warsaw and other places, and rampaged through Europe. Everybody knew this. So Lubitsch was dealing with this directly, and Hitler appears in the film, seen from behind in a few shots as he's going to a theater event. And then they have a guy imitating Hitler who's seen more often in the film. And so they're talking about him directly, and in the very first scene, making fun of Hitler. And part of what they're doing in the film is ridiculing him. And there's always been a question, and I talk about this in my book, How Did Lubitsch Do It? I go into this in detail because it's an important issue. How effective in propaganda is ridicule? And is it an appropriate thing to do to mock dictators, or terrible leaders? Hitler himself in Mein Kampf, his book in 1925, if people had read Mein Kampf, they would have known what he planned to do, because in the first paragraph he says he's going to conquer the world and get rid of the Jews. And I've always wondered, how come people didn't know this? And part of it was they didn't believe him when he said these things. They thought he was a buffoon and a comical figure. But part of it was they put out expurgated versions of this for foreign consumption. And there was not an accurate American translation of Mein Kampf until 1938, when Alan Cranston, who was an advertising man in New York, later became a senator from California, commissioned his own translation and published it himself, an accurate translation of Mein Kampf. And he got sued by Hitler for plagiarism, which he said was his greatest achievement in life, which is kind of funny. And I found when I did my Capra biography, I was going through the production files, and in Arsenic and Old Lace, which Capra made in 41, didn't come out till 44. But at one point, he was going to have a scene in which copies of Mein Kampf and Das Kapital by Karl Marx were seen in a bookstore window, and he was going to make jokes about it. And the Warner Brothers legal department advised him not to show either one because, they might get sued. I don't know if Karl Marx could sue because he'd been dead, but they were worried about Hitler suing. That shows the timidity as late as 41 of studios to some extent. And so here is Lubitsch openly, brazenly mocking the Nazis. And Hitler says in Mein Kampf, there's a chapter on war propaganda, which is very shrewd in some ways, because that's one thing he really knew well and brilliantly handled war propaganda. And one of the chilling things is he says that he learned everything from the Americans in World War I. Our propaganda was so good, he thought, that we took a country that didn't want war, and Wilson had won the presidency by promising we wouldn't have war in Europe, and he led us into war. And he had Edward Bernays and Walter Lippmann, who were the chief propagandists, turning the whole country around against the evil Hun, as they called the Germans, and showing, they lied a lot about them, killing babies and raping women and stuff, and a lot of this was exaggerated. And they got the public stirred up, and Hitler thought this was great propaganda, and he said our German propaganda at the time was pathetic and horrible. And he said things like, for example, if you're selling toothpaste, one thing you don't do is you say, our toothpaste is great, but the other guy's toothpaste has some good qualities and some bad qualities. He said you never admit the other guy has any good qualities. That's counterproductive. You just say his toothpaste is terrible and ours is great. And he said if you start giving people these either ors or what if or but this, you're going to confuse people. And so in World War II, Hitler used propaganda in the lead up to World War II as well to knock off one country after another by scaring them. And also he did a lot of, terrible physical things to scare them. But we learned from these mistakes, and our propaganda in World War II was quite blunt, as you see in the Capra Why We Fight films, for example. But Lubitsch used the technique of comedy, and Hitler says in Mein Kampf you should not use comedy to mock the enemy, because he said it's a mistake, because if your soldiers go into combat and they've been told that the enemy is ridiculous, they're going to be shocked and unprepared when they find out that the enemy is really ferocious. And he said they will not fight well because they'll be afraid. And that's an interesting point. So I guess Chaplin might agree with that in retrospect, that mocking Hitler as a way of belittling him and tearing down his mantle of invincibility, he might say, well, that wouldn't have prepared the country for how terrible, fighting the war actually was, or what he did to England, or what he did to other countries, or what he did to the Jews. But Lubitsch clearly didn't agree with that. He felt that mocking and belittling the Nazis was a good strategy, and I tend to agree with that. I mean, I can see that there are arguments on both sides, but I think in To Be or Not to Be, he's showing them as fallible human beings and weak people in some ways, and ridiculous in the sense that they're pretentious and foolish, and they have brute power on their side. That's true, and they can intimidate people, but they're basically vulnerable in the sense you can find weaknesses to get at them with. And so the theater troupe in the film exploits their vanity and their weaknesses and their stupidity, and to outwit them and then conquer them physically. And I think that's part of the message of the film. And it's sort of a propaganda film mixed with a romantic comedy and a black comedy. It's a whole mixture of genres. But it has a certain propaganda aspect, which Lubitsch intended. And the word propaganda is often seen as a pejorative expression, but as I point out, there's good propaganda and bad propaganda. For example, if you propagandize for world peace, what's wrong with that? But the danger is that propaganda and art can work at cross purposes, because propaganda can be just somebody giving a speech. However, in one scene that used to be criticized in The Great Dictator, at the end of the film, Chaplin, who's impersonating the Hitler character, he's a Jewish barber who is mistaken for the Hitler character, he turns to the audience and addresses us directly in a long speech, and he goes out of character and he's speaking as Chaplin. And it's a powerful speech calling for peace and against war, against fascism. And I remember for a long time people used to say they didn't like that scene because it broke the character and it was preachy and blah, 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 blah. But now I find people love that scene. And I see it called the greatest speech ever given, and it's seen as courageous, which I think it is. Here's a man, the most famous man in the world, really, Charlie Chaplin, and Hitler came along, and he was, I guess, his rival for most famous man in the world. They even looked a little alike. And Chaplin felt so compelled to speak out that he went out of character and spoke as himself to the audience, and I think it's tremendously moving. And To Be or Not to Be has a scene like that where Felix Bressart, who is Lubitsch's alter ego, the Jewish character in the film Greenberg, and they're not allowed to say the word Jew in that film. There was a taboo in Hollywood films against saying the word Jew until basically 1947, Gentleman's Agreement, which won the Best Picture Award. It was a film about anti-Semitism. Gregory Peck impersonates the Jew to go around and find out how much anti-Semitism there is in the country. And somebody said rather harshly that film, the message is you better be nice to a Jew because he might turn out to be a Gentile. I don't think it's a very good film, but Chaplin said the word Jew in Great Dictator, and both that and To Be or Not to Be are United Artists films. And United Artists was a major studio, but they're an independent company in a sense. They were formed by Chaplin, Griffith, Mary Pickford, and Douglas Fairbanks. And they never had a studio of their own. They rented studio space, and they produced their own films. That's why they created the studio, but then they started releasing films made by other producers. So Chaplin basically was the richest man in show business, and he owned the studio, so he could do whatever he wanted. So I think that's how he got away with saying the word Jew and making The Great Dictator. Whereas Lubitsch was working for United Artists, and the film was produced by Alexander Korda, who was a Hungarian Jewish producer who had moved to England, very successful, very good producer. And it turns out later he was a British spy in World War II. That's why he was later knighted. And he was coordinating a lot of British intelligence contacts in the U.S. So you have to kind of think that To Be or Not to Be was partly a propaganda intelligence production done through United Artists. So it was a bold film in that sense that violated a lot of the taboos in Hollywood. And Lubitsch paid the price because he got a lot of vicious attacks. But in his article in the New York Times, he says the public has voted for this film because they've gone to this film and showed their support and they enjoy the film. And the film, however, was carried on the books as a loss. It didn't do as well as it should have. And one reason was Carole Lombard was killed in a plane crash right before the film came out. And the film was in post-production. There's a kind of a feeling in Hollywood generally that if a star dies before a film comes out, it's going to hurt the box office because people, feel bummed out watching the film. And in this case, perhaps that was true because it's a romantic comedy. She's very beautiful, and it's painful to watch that. And over time, that's another aspect that's changed. People are not as affected by that now. We may or may not know that she died in this plane crash. And an interesting aside to that, I heard Orson Welles say he was shooting a TV show called The Orson Welles Show. And between takes, he was talking to the audience. I was an extra in the show. And he said Carole Lombard her plane was shot down by the Nazis in America. And she was killed in Nevada. And she was on a bond drive. She was the first big star in World War II to go on a bond drive after Pearl Harbor. And she was coming home from that in a plane with other people. And the plane hit a mountain. And it was a peculiar crash because it was a route that was often flown by pilots, and they knew that there was this mountain there, and they knew to go around it. But for some reason, the pilot flew right into the mountain, and the plane exploded. And there's a book on this called Fireball, which goes into this. And what Wells said was the people who know that the Nazis shot down the plane, but they don't want to talk about it because they don't want the public to think the Nazis have that capability. But he said that there were several important physicists on the plane with her. So it's not clear who the target was, but this has never been proven. And Wells was quoted as saying this in a book later, too. But the author of Fireball mentions this story, and he said he tried hard to either verify or disprove the story, and he couldn't. And he says it remains an open possibility that her plane was shot down. And he goes into great detail about, the details of the crash. And the plane was overloaded and various things, but they had hearings and investigations, and officially they could never find out a real reason for the crash. So it remains a possibility, but that's a bitter, I heard the whole production too, that she might have been killed by the Nazis. I don't know if they knew that she had just done an anti-Nazi film, but maybe they did, But the fact that she was on a bond drive one of the last things she did in life was UA was trying to change the title of To Be or Not to Be. They thought it was too esoteric for the public, which is kind of ridiculous, isn't it? I mean, the most famous line in literature, probably. And they wanted to change the title to The Censor Forbids, which is kind of an interesting title in a way because it deals with censorship both in the story and it's been read as a kind of fable about Hollywood censorship, that these people, who a lot of them are Jewish, are creating this fake Nazi scenario under the eyes of the Nazis. And somebody said that's like a parable of Hollywood in those days. But anyway, one of the last things Lombard did was send a telegram to United Artists and say she never would have agreed to be in a film called The Censor Forbids and don't change the title. I think Lubitsch may have helped put her up to that because he orchestrated a campaign to keep his original title, which is a powerful title. It deals in the Shakespeare play with suicide, but it's also about existential, survival. It's also about the theater, and Lubitsch was a huge admirer of Shakespeare. He had played in a lot of Shakespeare plays for Max Reinhardt. Oh, and the point I was going to make was Chaplin's great speech in The Great Dictator is echoed in To Be or Not to Be by Felix Bressart, who plays Greenberg, the Jewish character. And I was going to say he's not identified as Jewish directly, but by the word Jew, but almost the first thing that's mentioned is he turns to Lionel Atwill, who's a ham actor, and he says, "What you are, I wouldn't eat." So the audience is tipped off pretty early, and so he's the representative of Judaism in the film. Jack Benny was actually Jewish too, although most people may not have known that. But it's kind of interesting that he's sort of the covert Jew in the film, and Greenberg is the overt Jew. And at the end of the film, when they all wind up in England, well, they don't all wind up in England. The one who is missing is Greenberg. And I have to admit, it took me several viewings, and I read this. There's a terrific essay by Joel Rosenberg about this. He writes all about Greenberg, and after Greenberg confronts Hitler by doing the speech from Shylock's speech from Merchant of Venice, "Hath not a Jew eyes," a great speech, he disappears from the film, and he's not in the scene at the end, which is the Lubitchian ellipsis. Lubitsch has worked out so much with the ellipsis. This implies that he didn't make it to England, that he sacrificed himself for the cause. And it's chilling. The speech he gives is remarkable. Throughout the film, he's a small part actor who always wanted to play Shylock. And Lubitsch himself was like that. I think he really identifies with this character because he was doing secondary parts in Shakespeare plays. He played, for example, Shylock's servant for Reinhardt. But evidently, Lubitsch's audition speech for Reinhardt was that very speech, "Hath not a Jew eyes." And Greenberg delivers it. It's the most emotional moment in a Lubitsch film. He bursts out of the ladies' bathroom, just dressed in street clothes, and he confronts all these stormtroopers who are mixed in with Jack Benny's troupe, who are fooling them. And he addresses Hitler, who is actually an actor playing Hitler. But they're surrounded by real stormtroopers, and he's giving this impassioned speech, and Lubitsch does it in close-up. And I think that's kind of an equivalent to the Chaplin speech in The Great Dictator. It's addressing the audience, the world audience, about prejudice and why should we be persecuted just because we're Jews. It's a tremendously powerful scene, and Greenberg does it brilliantly with tremendous feeling. And he did it earlier in the film in a kind of more low-key way where he's rehearsing it. So it's a tremendous achievement for him, but also it shows great guts and courage, and probably loses his life for doing this. And it's Lubitsch's direct answer to anti-Semitism and the persecution of his people. A tremendously brave film. I mean, the more I think about this film, I'm just kind of in awe that somebody could make this film in 1941, 42. It's just astonishing, isn't it?
I've got one more question for you, because obviously you've seen a lot more Lubitsch films than I have, probably all of them. One of the few films of his that I have seen is Monte Carlo, and it's interesting to me that there's an echo in To Be or Not to Be that is in Monte Carlo, and I'm curious if it shows up in other things as far as jokes and the way that a joke will pass from one person to another. Because we've got that joke that Claude Allister, Duke von Lieberham, tells, and then he eventually, I think he realizes that he's telling it about himself after he's heard it from someone else. And then we have that joke about Hitler being a kind of cheese. Does that show up other places as well? Do we have that transmission of information through jokes in other Lubitsch films?
Yeah, that's a good catch you made there. That's a great example, and it's very funny, and it's a character-revealing trait that somebody, when he learns a joke, is being told about himself, but he's telling it, and then his face falls. It's wonderful. Well, Lubitsch did so many variations on gags, and one of the things that good comic filmmakers do is have running gags that pay off. I mentioned the hat scene in Ninotchka is really 3 scenes. And if you take out even the middle scene, it wouldn't be as effective. It's a build of things. Billy Wilder learned that his films are wonderfully constructed, and he'll plant something early in the film and then allude to it in the middle and then pay off later. Hitchcock does that in his films, not just for comic effect, but he'll repeat things 3 times. But he does it in different ways. But he was very concerned with clarity, which Wilder was and Lubitsch was too, that he wanted the audience to understand things. And if you're going to make people laugh, they kind of have to understand what's going on. Like if you're trying to figure out what's going on and you're baffled, you're not going to be laughing because you're going to be pondering. But if you're getting something, that's part of the joy of humor, is that you kind of explode with laughter when you get a joke. There's a scene in John Ford's Young Mr. Lincoln where Lincoln makes a joke and then everybody laughs, and then there's this 30-second pause, and suddenly the judge erupts in laughter. He says, "I just got it." It's a wonderful delayed reaction. Then the whole audience laughs again. So that's what Wilder calls the super joke. In Lubitsch films, the topper of the joke. You have a joke and then you top it. And so that's part of this repetition thing, is you repeat it, but it's not just repeating, it's repeating in a different way or building on something. And transmission of information or attitudes or sly innuendo is very much a part of his comic style. And you see that in the musicals and the romantic comedies. There's a lot of that where people are alluding to one thing or another. In Trouble in Paradise is a wonderful scene early on where the woman loses her handbag, and there's a whole elaborate scene about people trying to get the reward money by pretending that they have the handbag. But late in the film, when Herbert Marshall and Mary Hopkins are going to make their escape, the phone rings in the middle of this fairly intense scene, and he says, "What? You found a handbag? You're too late." And he hangs up. It's just a wonderful little throwaway gag that alludes to the earlier gag, but it's historically funny. But it's the kind of thing that happens in life where unexpected things happen. I often think in screenwriting there's a line from John Lennon: "Life is what happens when you're making other plans." And that's a good motto for screenwriters, because if you just follow a straight line, it starts to seem artificial. But if you throw in those kind of unexpected things, it seems like real life. However, it's also alluding to something that the audience knows from before. And so it's a topper for an earlier gag. Unexpected to the unexpectedness is part of the joy of the thing. And so Lubitsch was a master at that kind of thing. And I'm sure when they were having their story meetings, as you were asking about, him and Rafelson were sitting around kicking around ideas. One of them probably said, "What if the phone rings?" And some wild idea like that. And that's where they'd get some of their best scenes. But it takes a lot of work to come up with those and make them seem effortless, which is part of the genius of Lubitsch and part of the joy of his touch, which was so, it seems so compact and so efficient and effortless, but it was the result of tremendous hard work. But it's part of the art that disguises art in a way. And to get back to your question, I think that's one reason he's underrated, is that he didn't flaunt his art like showing off fancy shots, although there are a lot of fancy shots in this film, but they're done for comic effect or for emotional effect. And as Truffaut said, "I defy you to say there's a wasted shot in any Lubitsch film. I would call you a liar if you tried to tell me there was." And so every scene works, and it's in there for a reason. And the films are like beautiful clockwork, and we can marvel at their craftsmanship. But it's done in the service of humor and emotion, and that's really what he's communicating to us.
Professor McBride, thank you so much for your time tonight. I really appreciate this.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. This is a lot of fun to talk about Lubitsch, as always, and you always have great questions, so I really appreciate it.
Only Mel Brooks could see the funny side of Hitler's invasion of Poland. He will delight old fans and win many new ones with To Be or Not to Be, his funniest film ever.
me, I've invaded almost every country in Europe, and I still can't get a table at my favorite restaurant.
Brooks and Bancroft are the greatest duo since Bogart and Bacall, dancing their way through chaos as the theatre crumbles at their feet.
What's going on? All right, don't panic. You'll get your costume.
But the show must go on.
To be or not to be?
The glittering performances on stage don't hold a candle to what's going on behind as Anna Bronski signs autographs.
What? They're turning my house into Gestapo headquarters.
They are?
No, they're not. They cut off my gasoline. They closed my bank account. They took my pearl stick pin. They took my little pinky ring. They took the top off my gold cane. But they are not, I repeat, not taking my house. Never. Got everything?
Meanwhile, back at the ranch,
True love should never stand in the way of a good time.
All I want is peace. 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 A little piece of Poland, a little piece of France, a little piece of Portugal, and Austria perchance.
I asked them. Then shoot them and interrogate them.
Hurry, get into the...
this screamingly funny family film has more than enough singing, dancing, action, and comedy to fill with laughter any winter's night.
We'll be waiting for you.
All right, we're back and we're talking about To Be or Not to Be. Now, let's talk about the remake of the film that actually I had in my notes Mel Brooks directed, but it was actually Alan Johnson, the director of Solar Babies. And this was him, Mel Brooks, starring in it back in 1983. It was 41 years after the original film release. Not necessarily a good time for Nazis at this point. I had heard that this was so similar to the original, and it is so not that similar to the original. I mean, we start off with some things that are similar, but they really made this into a musical more than the original was. I mean, I don't think there's any singing in the original, but my God, there's a lot of singing and dancing going on in here, like the Sweet Georgia Brown thing right off the bat. And I mean, I love Mel Brooks in some things, but the man is not necessarily a good singer. It was kind of reminded me of a Cat in Heat a little bit. But the thing that really got me was just the ego. The Mel Brooks ego really took over this, that he had to play so many of the roles that it wasn't just him as Tura, that his character's name is Bronsky in this one. So he gets to be Bronsky and Tura at the same time. So he ends up getting to play Hitler in this film. And I thought that was a really good thing in the original, that Jack Benny wasn't playing Hitler, that he was playing the other roles. And even at the end, when he loses his mustache, Jack Benny's character loses his mustache, I thought, okay, well, they're going to stick the Hitler mustache on Jack Benny and he'll go in and he'll rescue his wife. But no, they sent Bronsky in, which I thought was a really nice thing that they give him that opportunity.
Well, in that context, it would have made sense for him to go get his wife. But because he lost the mustache,
he couldn't.
It's ingenious, some of the machinations they have to go on to put the plot forward. The whole scene with the dead Seletsky.
Oh, God.
How do you come from there's a dead guy in here to I'm going to prove that guy's the phony Seletsky and I'm the real one?
Oh, yeah.
Let's see what is going to happen to make that happen. I'm going to have to shave off his beard.
Your goatee when you're talking
I'm going to have to shave off his beard, take a fake beard that I just happen to have on me, knowing that they'll pull the beard to see whether it's real or not. I mean, the hoops that you have to jump through to get that and still make it seem like
and it's two
and
shots.
still make it work.
It's a shot of him pulling the beard out. You know, we've heard that in dialogue before that he has the extra beard, pulls that out, and then we see the razor, and that's it. And we put those things together. It's what you're talking about, 2 + 2.
I can't think of two more different filmmakers than Lubitsch and Mel Brooks.
Exactly.
Because Lubitsch is subtle.
It's the Lubitsch touch.
Right.
And it's the Mel Brooks sledgehammer.
Right. And Mel Brooks is like everything is on the nose.
Yeah.
Everything is 2 + 2 = 4, and he's going to tell you that it's 4.
I think maybe, I'm not sure about the production history of the remake. I think it was literally, it had turned into a Broadway play, a musical. And I think somebody thought, Hitler on the stage, producers.
It's great.
There you go.
Yeah, Mel Brooks, we have to do it that way.
Right.
Without taking any other thing into consideration.
Well, I mean, and times had changed, too.
Nazis, yeah.
Times had changed, too, to where maybe people were looking for more, broad comedy for the time. Mm-hmm. Maybe the sophistication was viewed as prudish or uptight.
Right, yeah.
Well, no, I'm not, Paula, I'm not really quite sure whether it was just like, maybe we can get some more money out of a Mel Brooks vehicle.
Yeah. That could be too.
Yeah.
I mean,
he was recycling himself in this one. I mean, because there's a music video that was released around the time of the release of the movie, and it was the Hitler rap. So first off, you're trying to, the Hitler rap. It's like fucking Rodney Dangerfield and those things, the Honeymooners rap that Piscopo and those guys were doing, so it's like, okay, we're going to capitalize on that. We're going to capitalize on music videos. We're going to have Mel Brooks dressed up as Hitler in this music video. And then he's going to quote himself. He's going to say the whole, don't be stupid, be a smarty, come and join the Nazi party. Mm-hmm. I mean, that, you're taking from your own jokes, Yeah. Come on, guy.
Yeah. There really is only so much mileage you can get out of that.
Yeah.
And I think that I like Dick Shawn's performance in The Producers.
Oh, yeah.
I think that's really rich and everything. But after that, you go to that, mill too often and it's going to come up dry. And ultimately, I think that's what happened here.
And I love Anne Bancroft, but she's no Carole Lombard, and
right.
That there's those things about.
Nobody had that combination of that elegance and the kookiness.
Right.
Yeah. No,
Nobody did that like her.
And there's the whole thing of Mel Brooks, the Bronski actor is too full of himself, and her name isn't even on the poster, or if it's on the poster, it's in parenthesis. So, yeah, he's playing that up, that he's supposed to be so full of himself, but it feels like that's too real. It feels like Mel Brooks really is full of himself in this film. So I'm not trying to pick on Mel Brooks. Like I said, I love the guy, and I love a lot of stuff that he did.
Sure.
I mean, Blazing Saddles, to me, is still one of the best movies ever made. But this one, man, it just was such a clunker.
How do you think Lubitsch would have done the farting scene?
Yeah, that's a good question.
People slowly leave the room with a slight look of distaste.
Right.
And,
Yeah. If some scenes can be done all through clocks, I mean, what can be done with that? I mean, it's that whole, how did Lubitsch do it? You think about how the scene can be done one way, and then you do it the different way.
Right.
To get that message across.
I'm not familiar with the remake. Did he have a share of writing credit for that, or was it just something that was drawn directly from the play, the musical version that had been on Broadway?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there were some interesting changes, like the maid that you're talking about, the assistant to Maria. She ends up becoming a gay guy in the remake. And it was interesting that it was one of the first times that they talked about how the gays were put into concentration camps. And he talks about the pink triangle and that it clashes with everything. So there's actually a couple funny lines here and there. But
I can buy that.
Yeah, but for the most part, it was really it hurt to watch it. And I can really see rewatching it or trying to rewatch it. I ended up watching a lot of it and fast forward. I can really see why I didn't want to go anywhere near Lubitsch's version after seeing that one when I was a kid. And the Hitler rap isn't in the movie. It's a side piece to it, but the jokes are very 1983, whereas with Lubitsch's, the jokes aren't necessarily 1942. You can watch that one now and be just as thrilled, just as happy.
Yeah, it's a general sensibility as opposed to a topicality.
So the writing credits are Thomas Meehan, Ronnie Graham, Edwin Justice Mayer,
who was the
original screenplay, Melchior Lengel,
who was the story,
and then Ernst Lubitsch was uncredited.
Well, he was uncredited as a writer, but everything I've read about
people know
Lubitsch's involvement with his films was that he co-wrote everything. He collaborated very
Right. I'm talking about the
closely with his
1983.
The 83 one
So
they
it's got
credited
two additional
is based
writers
on the screenplay. Is that
Right.
what they're saying?
But there's an additional story credit and 2 additional screenwriters.
We haven't said anything about Edwin Justice Mayer.
Yeah.
Who apparently was a super genius, and this was his one great film. He made a lot of stuff for all the major studios, but he had one play, Firebrand, I think, that really took off on Broadway, and then he went to Hollywood and became part of the intelligentsia circle. S.N. Berman and other people, Mankiewicz, who are part of that, and so this was like huge for him to be involved
I think Lubitsch offered it to Samuelson or Raphaelson, and he rejected it. He says, "I don't think it's a funny story."
I'm not sure I follow you.
Lubitsch tried to get Samuel Raphaelson, his regular.
Yes, he rejected it.
And he rejected it based on the
fact
that he just thought it was tasteless to do that then.
Yeah.
Which, was...
But Lubitsch had done one other film, I forget which one, with Mayer as well. So they did have prior experience together. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. It was interesting because there was talk during the production about whether or not who would want to be involved in this. And that there were several people who were invited to be part of the film. I don't think Carole Lombard was the original choice to play Maria Tura. I think it went through...
it was Miriam Hopkins, actually.
Miriam Hopkins.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Because he did like to work with the same people.
Yeah. I wanted
I can find out about that.
to touch briefly on the scene in the film that I thought was kind of propagandistic. The voiceover, the narrative voiceover. I don't know how much of that was controlled. Did he have a final cut on the film?
Yes, he did. Yeah,
he did have final cut on the film.
So
it may have been just a suggestion or something, or when the war had started in earnest, they thought that it would have been good to add this voiceover.
You're talking about the voiceover at the beginning of the film, though.
No, when the film was made.
Yeah.
And the war hadn't started during the production of the film.
Right.
The American involvement had not been started during the production of the film. In post-production, I'm thinking that there may have been an idea of how can we make this a little bit more gung-ho, because the content itself, like I've been saying, or like what I think is that it's not really anti-Nazi enough. Not that it's pro-Nazi, but it plays as more of a comedy, suspense thriller, romance combination of that, as opposed to like being a war film.
Yeah.
Like we're up to our necks in war, all those elements make up the bulk of the movie. There's nothing really warlike. It just more or less seems more like a bureaucratic movie. Like we're dealing with bureaucracies here. It's just that some guys are wearing uniforms and they're bureaucrats.
Right. So Ken was talking about the scene when the Poland is invaded, and there's that voiceover talking about the V for victory, right?
Right.
And it's that same voiceover artist, but it is much more bombastic than
it's
it was
meant
at the
to
beginning.
stir.
Yes.
Yeah.
But a new spirit had come over the people of Poland. Hate and more hate was the answer to the Nazi terror. Rebellion against suppression. Determination to fight at any moment, anywhere, everywhere. The battle was on. V for victory. Down with the Nazis, down with Hitler. The Warsaw Underground striking back. Sabotage, destruction. But the real fight for Polish freedom was led somewhere in England. Young men of Poland avenging their country. The Polish squadron of the RAF.
And it seems a little bit out of place for me,
yeah.
because that is not the voice of Lubitsch.
Right.
That's not the way he would handle.
Yeah, it sounds very much like a post-production.
Tack on.
Yeah.
Tacked on.
Yeah, and then later on, after the theater scene, when Hitler's at the theater, and they don't blow up the theater, which was, unusual. I'm used to them blowing up Hitler movies.
Which I love to see.
Right? Yeah. Oh no, it's great, especially just to see him just die because of nitrate film. When they look out the window and they see that a place is burning, and Bronsky's like, "Oh yeah, the resistance." I was like, "Okay, that's nice." It kind of brings us back to that point, but doesn't hit us over the head with that. I mean,
right?
But yeah, to your point, I mean, mean, we talked, Paula, you talked about the Lubitsch touch, and we talked about the Mel Brooks sledgehammer, and that V for victory, the hatred, that is kind of a heavy touch, let's say, compared to the rest of this film.
There's broken windows in a bookstore that have Mein Kampf in the bookstore window. Mm-hmm. Glass being broken and all that stuff. So.
Right. Yeah. And then that second instance of the Shylock speech with, them out cleaning up the streets, it looks like. And, that's kind of a nice thing. Yeah. God, I just remember that not only does Brooks get to play Hitler in the remake, but he even plays that role. He even gives the Shylock speech. It's just like every moment that you can think of.
He's like the real life Joseph Tura.
Oh yeah.
Didn't they have any other stars in this film?
They had Jose Ferrer and they had Tim Matheson, but as far as like that
actual stars.
But I mean, the guys
Anne
that played. Well, Anne Bancroft, but the guys who played, Mr. Mr. Greenberg and Mr. Pronsky, they weren't, we see them in other movies and stuff, but they weren't. They're not Jack Benny.
I think the temptation would be how do we update this, and how do we make it for contemporary audiences? And my reaction would be, don't bother,
right?
But for some reason, I think that. I don't know who makes these decisions. There was a Broadway musical of Sunset Boulevard.
Right.
And it's like, why?
I never saw it. Yeah. I've seen Sunset Boulevard, the movie, many, many times.
Right. Yeah. Maybe
I guess I don't feel it necessary.
Goes back to the paucity of original ideas in Hollywood.
And sometimes you can see stuff that gets a new spin on it, and you're like, okay, well, that's an interesting thing.
Remakes have been going on since the beginning of Hollywood, beginning of film.
Oh, sure, certainly, but the idea of a musical version of this, that, or the other, there is the thought in someone's head, we'll do a musical version of this, and someone will make a movie out of it. So we're going to get paid twice for it,
Right. Well, the producers.
Hairspray.
Yeah. I mean, even going back to Little Shop of Horrors, So.
Well, the producers was a film, then it became a musical of the film, then it became a film of the musical of the film.
Yeah.
I haven't really bothered to check that out.
Me either.
I noticed even while comparing the two films, Trouble in Paradise was like 19 minutes shorter. I have more to say about that.
It zips by, though, doesn't it?
It zips by, and there's more that is, I think that in some ways, To Be or Not to Be is less of a Lubitsch film because of the various different elements that were involved. The idea that it had to be different because it had to involve like a larger universe than Lubitsch was used to, triangles, basically. But this was like World War II. So a certain amount of the film had to be delegated to that. The plot more or less drove it more, and I think that the other film was more character driven. And so I always find things that are more character driven be more interesting for me as opposed to more specifically story driven. So for me, I thought I really don't have as much to say about To Be or Not to Be as I do about Trouble in Paradise. And you would think that wouldn't be the case because the one film is so much more.
Right. You've got the timeliness. You've got the historical context you can talk about.
Yeah. But I really don't know what to say about that stuff.
No, I gotcha.
Did you know that Cahiers du Cinema does a every 10-year poll, greatest movies of all time thing, and To Be or Not to Be was 13th.
What was number one?
Citizen Kane. Trouble in Paradise.
Yeah, I was going to say
Trouble in Paradise was 61st. So I mean that shows you the kind of regard that Lubitsch has, obviously, in France. I don't know. I just thought that was an interesting side note. Maybe it has something to do with the fact that the war affected the French so directly, and so it may have had more of an impact over there or something.
Well, and then speaking to the Polish resistance, and the resistance was so big in France and just such a major part of their lives.
Interesting that Max Ophuls is a big Lubitsch fan, and not only that, also Marcel Ophuls is a big.
Well, okay.
I believe that.
Yeah, I do too. Yeah. I could see the Max Ophuls thing specifically because they were both sophisticated, witty, and they their films involved complicated relationships.
Right.
Exactly.
Going back to Madame Deux, I mean, to have that whole relationship being built up by the dances. I mean, that seems like such a Lubitsch thing, like how can we present these two falling in love in a way that we haven't seen before? In one, you've got the clocks, and one, you've got the dances.
Right.
It's like time and
show, don't tell.
Exactly.
Well, Lubitsch does that in A Lot of Woman on a Woman as well, where they dance in the Prater.
Right.
Same idea with turning the lights off.
I haven't
and
seen that one
everything,
in a long time.
One emphasized the comic, one emphasized the more dramatic.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, but I could weep at the end of Trouble in Paradise just as I could with Madame Deux.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's what I didn't really get to talk about for To Be or Not to Be. When he's actually decides that he's going to go through with it and get killed, it's sad. It's the dark from the light and the light from the dark. There's that moment where he's like, yep, my life's over. You can just see it on his face. Wow, this is it. And then he goes on and does it.
Let's go ahead and take another break and play a preview for next week's show.
Ruttle's story is a legend, a living legend, a legend that will live long after lots of other living legends have died. Tonight, we are extremely proud to present the semi-legendary life story of the Prefab Four, Dirk, Nasty, Stig, and Barry, who made the 60s what they are today, the fabulous Ruttles.
From these streets, very close to the cavern Rutland, came the fabulous Rutland sound, created by the Prefab Four, Dirk, Nasty, Stig, and Barry, who created a musical legend that will last a lunchtime. They were discovered by their manager, Leggy Mountbatten, in a lunchtime disco very close to these streets. Their first album was made in 20 minutes. The second took even longer. Tonight, we examine the legend of the Ruttles. We look at their lives, their loves, their music. We examine some of the problems that made them what they are today. And we shall also be asking some of the people who worked with them whether they were really the sort of lovable people they were made out to be. We shall be asking many people who knew them what they were really like.
When I fell for you, I didn't need a shove. Now that we are two, it all adds up to love, love life, make up your mind, love life in your own time, love life is love, got the middle, baby in the middle, I feel rich, I feel full, I'm in doubt, I feel sure, I'm in love, I must be in love. Time goes by as we all know, naturally. People come and people go, naturally. Let's be natural. Ever since the world began, let's be natural. Every woman, every man, let's be natural. Let's follow nature's plan, let's be natural. Oh yeah.
That's right. We'll be back next week with our 400th official episode of the Projection Booth, where we'll be discussing the Ruddles, All You Need Is Cash. Until then, I want to thank this week's co-host. So, Paula, what is the latest with you in Cinema Detroit, ma'am?
I'm still the co-founder and programmer at Cinema Detroit, located at 4126 3rd Street in Detroit, zip code 48201. And all our current features and showtimes may always be found at cinemadetroit.org.
How about you, Lutz?
I got a long-term project, really long-term, on rental studio independent production in Hollywood from circa 1919, right after the war, and up to 1956, when every studio became a rental lot, really, basically. Ultimately, had to make the decision to go back to the silent era, and I'm doing a production history of Marshall Nealon's Dinty from 1920. First serious role by Colleen Moore, and first real appearance by Anna Mae Wong. And some really interesting stuff. It's on YouTube if you want to check it out. Dinty is a newsboy.
How about you, Ken?
Still got the band. We're still...
Is it still
Boys
loud?
Night Out. We're still loud.
Okay.
Working on a video editing project. And still retired. And I think I have a trip to Europe in my future, like in June or something like that.
Excellent.
So, yeah.
Better hurry up.
Yeah.
Huh?
Better hurry up.
Right.
Before anything crazy happens.
Yeah.
Before we can't go over to Europe anymore.
That's true. Or go anywhere anymore.
So, where can people go if they want to hear Ken's Loud Band?
We have a Facebook page. Ken's Loud Band should get you there.
All right.
There's stuff on Bandcamp and SoundCloud and your various different free musical services.
You're just making up words now. SoundCloud.
Yeah.
SoundCamp.
Yeah.
All right.
But Ken's Loud Band.
All right.
3 separate words.
All right.
With an apostrophe in there somewhere.
Somewhere. Yeah. Any umlauts or?
No umlauts.
Okay, all right.
Accent aigu.
Very nice. Thanks again, guys, for being on the show. Thanks to everybody for listening. Please head on over to the website projection-booth.com where you can find out more about today's episode. You'll also find links over to iTunes where you can rate and review the show, and to Patreon where you can make a donation to the show. Donors get early access to every episode as long as I'm not running late. Every donation and every rating we get helps the Projection Booth take over the world.
what I wanted, but it wasn't enough. So I called the boys. I said, boys, get down. Now I surrounded myself with some unusual cats. There were skinny little girls and girl Mr. Facts. Let's not forget old Himmler and Hess. You better believe we made a hell of a mess. Say hi, ziggity hi. We're gonna rip it on the people Teutonic style. Jack, you can't get down. From the Rhine with the finest ladies, and he did it in the back of my black Mercedes. I was on a roll I couldn't lose. Then came D-Day, the birth of the blues. The Yanks and the Brits started raising cane. Those guys were a pick, drove me insane. People all around me started swallowing pills. Let's face it, folks, we was going downhill. Berlin was crumbling, we was under the gun. Time to look out for number one. So I grabbed a blonde and a case of beer. Said the Russians are coming, let's get out of here.
Get to the top. You sure made history, and it felt so good to me. Ooh, shots and please don't ever stop.
I'll do the same. Good to see you. Got a one-way ticket to Argentina.
I'm not to be. Oh, baby, can't you see? We gotta take it to the top.
If you enjoy this show and want more people to know about it, head on over to iTunes, leave a comment, and rate it 5 stars. Make sure you like and share us on Facebook, and don't forget to follow us on Twitter. Just search for Christopher Media. Thank you in advance for supporting Christopher Media by clicking on the PayPal button and by clicking through to all the sponsors who support ChristopherMedia.net. Most importantly, we would like to take the time to extend an extra special thanks to you. Christopher Media could not exist without your support. Thank you for visiting ChristopherMedia.net, and thank you for listening. Christopher Media. Let's make some noise.